Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and joining me on the sofa this week, we have Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And we're delighted to have joining us down the line, Spike columnist and founder of the Equiano project, Inaya Folarin Iman.
Hi.
So coming up in today's show, the violent turn in trans activism, the madness of Humza Yousaf, and the tyranny of net zero. So I think it's fair to say there's been a few incidents in the past week or so that have confirmed what we kind of knew about trans activism. Firstly, that it's irrational. Secondly, that it's misogynistic. And thirdly, that it has a propensity or a willingness to sort of flirt with violence. First off, let's talk a little bit about the Kellie-Jay Keen incident in Auckland, New Zealand. So Kellie-Jay Keen, also known as Posey Parker, was hounded by a trans activist mob, was afraid of her life. She was, almost crushed. She had liquid porn over her. I mean, Tom, how the hell do you explain these kinds of scenes in the 21st century where essentially you have a woman organising an event called Let Women Speak, just wanting women to talk about their experiences, and it's being attacked?
Well, I think it's relatively easy to explain as far as I think it's misogyny which is driving all of this. And I think the thing that makes it difficult for people to understand that is because this is a misogyny that is posing as progressive, effectively. But when you see scenes of men stopping women from speaking in public about their own rights and their own experiences, men physically accosting women for daring to air those rights, hurling sexualized insults at them and so on, I don't think you can call this anything other than misogyny. I think what trans activism has done, and the extreme fringes of it, is that it seems to have rehabilitated a kind of woke misogyny, a kind of acceptable misogyny, which is not subtle at all in the way that it expresses itself. I'm sure we'll go into some of the details about what happened in New Zealand as well as Australia, but also this, as you suggest, this doesn't happen in a vacuum either. So essentially, on the same weekend that there were these scenes in Auckland, which the images of which have gone around the world now, there was almost like a mini Auckland going on. It's in Hyde Park, at Speaker's Corner, which is where these Let Women Speak events have a monthly end of the month event, essentially. And you had, again, in the kind of drizzling rain, a small group of gender critical women, again, organised there to do their thing, to speak and so on, surrounded by a group of trans activists who were chanting, "The only good Nazi is a dead one, so just go kill yourself."
Yeah.
Meanwhile, you've got police who, for a brief time, form a pretty thin barrier around these women, and then the film departing and walking off. Again, you're seeing that intense dehumanization, intimidation, violent rhetoric. There was no violence on that particular day, I should say, but we have seen violence around a lot of gender critical events in the UK in recent years. I mean, in Speaker's Corner itself, back in 2017, this was one of the things that I think woke a lot of people up to what was going on with this particular form of activism. You had a 60-year-old woman called Maria McLaughlin who was waiting to go and see a gender critical event. That was the meeting point. They would then go to the venue instantly because it had been cancelled elsewhere. And a 26-year-old male trans activist, transgender identified person, punched this 60-year-old woman in the face. Again, when you see things like this, what other can you call it than misogyny? But there seems to be a lot of people who are still very much invested in trying to present this as the new civil rights movement, when it clearly is anything but.
I mean, what have you made of the sort of rhetoric surrounding this, the sort of demonisation of these women? I mean, they've obviously, everyone's familiar with the word TERF. Some people have sort of reclaimed that, but Kellie-Jay Keen was consistently referred to as a Nazi by both the media and by top politicians in Australia, including the Victoria Premier Dan Andrews, or at least they tried to make that association between them and Nazis. I mean, doesn't that invite this kind of, or encourage this kind of response?
Well, I mean, it just shows how lost in perspective this debate has come, particularly driven by the trans activist side. I mean, this is not Islamic fundamentalists preaching violence and hate and misogyny. This isn't neo-Nazis and far-right extremists going around internationally to kind of bring people to their cause. It's primarily women talking about views and promoting a particular view that sex is real and it's binary, and that we should consider and protect female-only spaces, and not relax the laws that are being kind of advocated to make it easy for people to essentially self-identify as a different gender and have access to all of the rights and protections and privileges that many women have fought for their own safety for the last kind of century or so. I mean, this is a completely normal, a completely mainstream view, and one that I would argue, and many of most people agree with.
Yeah.
This is not a fringe perspective, and I think it just shows how completely detached and insular many of these activists have become, but the complete cowardice and license that many politicians and senior figures in Australia and other parts of the political and cultural media elites are siding with people completely at odds and contemptuous of the views of the majority. And I think it is a huge indictment, incredibly sad, and no wonder so many people continue to feel scared to talk about this because if this is what potentially can happen, and Posey Parker, Kellie-Jay Keen, she's not any shrinking violet.
Yeah.
She's of course provocative, but that is absolutely her right in a very live and real debate that's going on about these issues. So I think the way that she's been treated is completely disgusting.
I mean, ultimately, the most provocative, allegedly, thing that she's saying is that men can't become women. That is sort of that's the end point of the argument, and she expresses that in a more in just a very forthright way, which people can't seem to handle.
No, exactly, and I think that's in a way is the genius of her activism, is that what she is saying and what she is setting out to do is so seemingly straightforward. A T-shirt that says "Woman, Adult, Human, Female," an event that says "Let Women Speak." Again, these events, she's replicated them across the UK and the US, where she sets up, she addresses the crowd, and then invites women up to say their piece. This is then met by a response which is, "How dare you do that, you witch?" I mean, it's this.
Yeah.
It's really flushed out those kind of that nascent sort of bigotry which exists on the trans activist set, and I think what we're now seeing, probably as a consequence of the fact that there has been a tremendous pushback led by a lot of gender critical activists, as well as everything from athletics bodies and so on to this ideology, that you feel like it's becoming increasingly enraged, increasingly irrational. And there's something going on here where this grievance politics, which has been developing not just within the gender ideology kind of discussion, not just within the trans activist set, which of course we should always distinguish from trans people themselves, but in identity politics more broadly, where you have extreme narratives of victimhood, such as that you hear bandied around, like the idea that people like gender critical activists or whatever are engaged in effectively a kind of genocidal campaign against trans people by showing up and wanting to say their piece. The idea that, again, this oppression of that particular community is so intense as to effectively amount to a kind of crime against humanity. That's a pretty alarmist and intense kind of argument in itself. The problem is it does have is legitimized by kind of institutions in society that should know better, or at least it's definitely not pushed back on sufficiently. So you have that being kind of fed, and then particularly because this is such a illiberal, irrational movement that not only doesn't want to engage in argument, seems incapable of engaging in argument, you also see this resorting to violence. And I think that's one thing that we need to be really clear on, and Inaya's already touched on this, which is that the demonization is also something that we need to be, is obviously feeding the violence as well. If you call someone a Nazi, you are saying that they are fair play, that they are effectively dehumanized, they're fair play to be beaten up, to be attacked in that kind of way, it's this very clear dynamic now, which is to say that this over-the-top rhetoric is not just over-the-top in and of itself. It's something which is really feeding some of the incredibly febrile atmosphere that we're seeing. And again, this is something which isn't being challenged nearly enough. If anything, it continues to be indulged. You certainly saw it in Australia and New Zealand, where you saw mainstream publications repeating this slur happily, contributing to the demonisation, putting a target on these women's backs. And that's something that has really got to stop. I think people have really got to be called out on those kind of comparisons, not because it's ahistorical and lazy and deeply offensive to the experience of the Nazis and the Holocaust and so on, but just because of the fact we know what game is being played here and it has very dangerous consequences.
We should move on to talk a little bit about the Nashville shooting, horrific school shooting. 6 people have died, 3 children have died, killed by Aubrey Hale, 28-year-old woman who identifies as male. Now, at the moment, there isn't any suggestion, or we don't know what the motive is, whether that had anything to do with this woman's trans identity. A manifesto will be released. But I think we can start to talk about the atmosphere around it, some of the reaction. I mean, particularly in the mainstream press, there's been this sense that, this killing is really bad news for trans people, even though they were not the victims here. I mean, what have you made of that kind of response?
Well, it's been striking insofar as I think a lot of arguments that people would make in other contexts they're not making here. One of which is that you've seen a pretty strong pushback from various kind of LGBT organisations, which is to say that the manifesto, which we know does exist, we just don't know what's in it yet. There's been some slightly cryptic comments from the police chief there in Nashville suggesting that this could have been fueled by resentment of some kind to do with the school, which was a religious school, which Audrey Hale herself attended when she was a child. But all that's been very vague, and obviously we shouldn't comment on that until we know the full details of it. But there's been explicit calls to say, don't release the manifesto.
Yeah.
Now, there's always a big ethical discussion about how much you should platform the individual, let alone their ideas, in a situation when they've just committed a mass atrocity. But these are arguments that people wouldn't make in other situations, so I think that's pretty telling. There's also been a bit of in many mainstream American publications to suddenly talk about how this is again to stoke the fears of backlash as well, to talk about this in terms of there was a report, I think it was NBC, talking about a drag queen who was now hiring 8 armed guards rather than 3, and it's not that you want to discount their own particular feelings in this situation, it's just to say, do we really want to be in a situation where 6 people have just been killed, 3 of which are children, without even wanting to speculate on the motives and so on, that this is now flips into this very narrow discussion about fears of a backlash, because there is this assumption that people are so easily ticked off by events that they will lose all sense of humanity and then just go and lash out at innocent people. Again, we need to kind of get past that. But then there's also kind of this response, and one needs to take it with a bit of a pinch of salt, but the way in some of the kind of more extreme parts of the trans activist sphere, where again it's just you still see a kind of continuation of a lot of this very quite aggressive rhetoric, people posing with weaponry and so on, even in the wake of a shooting like this. So it's stirred up a lot of double standards, shall we say, in terms of atrocious acts of violence discussed in very different ways, depending essentially on the identity of the perpetrator and what their purported motives might be, which is incredibly unseemly. But I think has also just demonstrated that everything is kind of viewed through that particular lens in a way that I think not only gets people ahead of themselves in commenting on certain things, but also gets us away from what is actually the tragedy that has actually taken place there, I suppose.
I saw some really horrific videos posted by libs of TikTok with some, I assume, extreme activists, essentially saying things that I wouldn't even really like to repeat, almost apologism for the horrific and horrendous act of violence that has taken place. And it really just shows that how can people even be brave enough, really, to post their face and say such horrible things and think that actually they live in a culture and a society that there's not going to be any real consequences for that, because the zeitgeist is on their side. That actually, if you transgress or are perceived to have transgressed against certain ideas around gender, then you can the consequences are fair game, as we kind of talked about earlier. And I think it just exposed just how far certain people are willing to make these kinds of arguments. And on top of that, gender ideology, it reveals again the way that it obscures facts and reporting. I mean, when this first came out, I was just trying to understand what had happened, and some people said it was a trans man, some people said it was a trans woman, a female, a male. I had no idea what even the emergent facts were happening. And in that, we can't actually know the truth and the reality of what's gone on. And that is, devastating for the victims and the family, and actually understanding the actual full scope of the situation. So, yeah, I just think that, obviously more facts will emerge as the kind of days and weeks, and we have to be kind of careful about what we say, in this situation. But some of the really divisive reaction has been just incredibly telling about where we're at when it comes to this conversation.
And just to tack onto that as well, I think even when you've got outside of the more extremes of this debate and what they've been saying on social media and so on, it's even been very interesting to see some of the mainstream discussion, which will pivot away from talking about this particular attack to laws that have been passed in Tennessee around clamping down on gender affirming care for young people, or restrictions on drag queen events, particularly ones that are held in public buildings and so on. That is an implied contextualization, justification of what it is that we've seen, even in the absence of any motive. And I think that's that kind of narrative, even when it's expressed slightly more subtly, should still deeply disgust us, I think, basically.
So this week, Humza Yousaf was voted as the new leader of the SNP and becomes the first Minister of Scotland, replacing Nicola Sturgeon. He beat his rival Kate Forbes by 52 to 48 after second preference votes, the golden ratio or cursed ratio, depending on your opinion. Tom, he should have done a lot better, really. I mean, I know he won, obviously, but considering that this is a man who had the fulsome backing of the SNP establishment and his rival Kate Forbes was utterly demonised, shouldn't he really have walked it a lot more?
Well, in that sense, it's very interesting because the result on paper looks like exactly what everyone would thought. He was the continuity candidate.
Yeah.
He was essentially Sturgeon's handpicked successor. She didn't quite say that, but it was made very clear by the actions of her allies in the last few days of the campaign. You saw John Swinney, her outgoing sort of deputy, throw his lot in with Humza, which upset many people in the Kate Forbes camp. You also... There was worst kept secret in Edinburgh that Humza Yousaf was obviously that guy. But again, this is something that's been striking throughout the campaign, is that to an extent, whilst Nicola Sturgeon maintained a very tight grip on her particular party, Sturgeonism, such as it is not. And in her absence, it seems like he's finding it incredibly difficult to kind of pick up that mantle, so much so that, as you say, even in a SNP leadership race with a party membership that we were told was so incredibly socially liberal, by which they kind of mean woke and intolerant, they couldn't possibly countenance someone like Kate Forbes, a socially conservative Christian, being anywhere near Butte House, that it became incredibly close, that they seemingly largely rejected that demonisation, that pretty concerted campaign suggested that she was an illegitimate candidate to lead this particular party. Completely failed. So whilst the result wasn't that surprising, I think it showed us that these ideas, the ideas that have really derailed the kind of SNP campaign, this weddedness to this woke intolerance, the general kind of failures of the kind of tight clique around Sturgeon, even the SNP sort of selectorate are seemingly starting to tire and break away from that. So very interesting on that front.
Definitely. And Inaya, what do you make of Humza? You excited for his leadership?
Well, I mean, as someone who broadly thinks that the union is a good thing, I think he's a great asset to the unionist cause. I mean, he's really got nothing, just nothing. He said the first thing he's going to do, his principal mission, is to enact this gender self-ID law, which is the very thing that brought down his predecessor. Not dealing with the drugs deaths in Scotland, the crisis in education, the cost of living issues that all of us are facing. Issues around energy and security and so on. Actually, very big challenges. I would say that Scotland has it, including the rest of the United Kingdom. His principal issue is this gender self-ID, and I just think it's really embarrassing. I mean, there is some hope. It's great to see that actually. I mean, even though she had her flaws, it's good to see that 48% of SNP voters were willing to change tack and do something different. But it just tells you that how little wind is really left in this kind of SNP Scottish independence cause. It's not based off of a radical transformative vision that democratic and sovereign. It's really just this kind of very boring, predictable, tried and tested and failed kind of so-called progressive agenda that is deeply anti-democratic and doesn't actually address any of the kind of genuine material concerns that people have in society, and is based off of so much of a kind of grievance politics. So I think he wants to take that cause on. I wish him good luck, but I doubt it's going to inspire many Scottish voters or bring him the independence that apparently they want.
Well, I mean, one thing a lot of people have suggested is that Humza is someone who's sort of failed upwards, given his terrible record across pretty much every ministry he's been in, whether it's transport, health, justice. And he's quite a gaffe-prone politician. Probably the best gaffe recently was during the campaign was when he spoke to a bunch of Ukrainian women and asked them where the men were. Think about that. Think about that for a second.
Yeah, did he mean that as a joke? I mean, it was one in a long line. I mean, the scooter is a personal favourite.
Yeah, oh God.
It's when he'd hurt his ankle and he was rolling around in this little knee scooter, and then reportedly, from what you hear, he saw the camera up ahead and wanted to show off a bit. Then falls off the scooter, then gets upset that the BBC tweet the video.
Well, exactly. It made 10 times funnier by him getting angry about it, about people sharing it on social media.
It is that reminder that he is sort of all the dreadful policies of the Sturgeon era with none of the polish. I mean, he's just such a bungler, and it is constantly quite amusing. I mean, the other thing, of course, and we've spoken about this last time we spoke about him, but that speech he gave in Holyrood where he essentially denounced the fact that the holders of high office across Scotland were all white. He kind of listed them off. The Lord Advocate, white, every police chief inspector, white, and so on. I mean, Scotland is a very white country, like much more than England. And yet this apparently hadn't really dawned on him. So you do hope that all of these things will stand, again, the health of politics across the UK in good stead. I think it is nevertheless important to count against complacency, particularly those of us who oppose Scottish secession for all the reasons that Inaya was talking about. The fact that no one's still really talking about the SNP not being the largest party at the next election in Scotland. Yeah. It's vice-like grip for a long time, which I think has been shown to be a lot weaker than people were given to think. Is nevertheless pretty significant, and that's something which I think there can be no, as I say, complacency when it comes to taking this off. A lot over the course of the past 6 months, a lot of that is rotten about both the SNP machine and the independent project under their kind of stewardship has been brought out into the open, but the job surely isn't done in terms of pushing that back quite firmly.
Definitely. In terms of the rottenness, it is worth, reminding people that the chief executive of the SNP resigned in the middle of this campaign, Pete Morrell, who's also Nicola Sturgeon's husband, which shows you the kind of cliquishness of the party. He had to resign because he was allegedly giving false membership statistics. There's been a huge drop in membership since both the sort of failed Supreme Court challenge and since the obviously infamous Gender Recognition Act. And so it was interesting that lots of people who would have resigned, would have tired of Nicola Sturgeon's inability to get independence over the line. Maybe those people have gone to sort of the Alba Party, which is a bit more hard line on this. And those people who will have left over the gender recognition bill, still many of them not backing the obvious candidate for who represents that kind of cause. We should briefly mention the famous prayer selfie that Humza Yousaf released on his first day in Butte House. I mean, Inaya, what have you made of the reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, it just reveals that the double standard. I mean, Kate Forbes, as we know, was seriously, scrutinised and criticised very strongly for holding the views that she had, her kind of traditional Christian views, the Free Church of Scotland, and Humza Yousaf praying, which he has a right to do, but in an all male prayer, what was lauded and praised in this wonderful way. But we fully know that if Kate Forbes did the same thing, that people probably would have said all sorts of horrible things about her and what she's doing. And it really does show the double standards about how we treat some religions that on the kind of hierarchy of identity and hierarchy of victimhood can claim greater kind of moral and cultural superiority over others. And the double standard really highlighted that.
And it's also worth stressing as well, and Brendan made this point in his piece about this week, which is that this hierarchy is also amongst ethnic minority groups and minority religions as well. So Rishi Sunak being a practicing Hindu, even having little Ganesha on his desk at work and so on. You didn't see there was a kind of bit of residual sort of gushing over representation and so on. It didn't last very long, but certainly from the left, the response you got was that he's a water carrier for, again,
Hindu nationalism
linked up with white supremacy. These are the kinds of arguments you see on that particular part of politics. So this kind of hierarchy of what identities are deemed to be celebratory and so on is very much there. And also, if we're being honest, a lot of this just cuts down politically. Like if a particular ethnic minority has the wrong kind of politics, then they can quickly be cast out of the, again, this community of the good very quickly.
Yeah, and it just shows just how tedious and tiresome the politics of identity are. I mean, Humza Yousaf, his position as the leader of Scotland is an incredibly consequential position for everyday Scottish people in terms of what kinds of things, what vision does he have for Scottish society, what's his track record, and how is he going to implement and make Scotland a more freer and prosperous society. Those really important questions about his politics and his actual ability are completely sidelined and kiboshed in favour of very shallow celebrations about his skin colour or how he expresses his religion. Like, what are the real questions that hold him to account, keep him on his toes, and make sure that he actually does a good job? But identity politics washes over all of those things. And if you sing the right notes and wear the right things, then that's all that matters.
So finally, let's talk about net zero. The UK government has relaunched its plans for net zero. It was essentially ordered to by the courts, who decided that its plans were not detailed enough. I mean, a lot of what has been announced we've seen before. So we've got a renewed commitment to renewable energy as well as some nuclear energy thrown in there. We're still planning to ban gas boilers and replace them with heat pumps. We're going to not have petrol cars anymore, and they're all going to be replaced with electric cars. It's going to be lots of home insulation, all the usual stuff. But Tom, we're in the middle of an energy crisis still. People are still really feeling the pinch. I mean, why is net zero still going ahead?
I think it's because it's just now an unshakable part of elite orthodoxy. I don't think they could shake it even if they wanted to at this point. It's a fascinating spectacle of the courts effectively demanding a more detailed plan for eco-austerity from the government. But you're also getting that from all kinds of other forms of elite power and influence, whether it's the cop circus or whether it's just the mainstream elite media or whatever. Again, the constant pressure being exerted upon them to, again, usher in eco-austerity quicker and in a more detailed fashion than they've otherwise laid out. And it's like the countervailing pressure of the state that the economy is in, the problems of energy security, which have been unearthed by the course of the past year or so, alongside the obvious democratic pressures which will exist from MPs having their inboxes full up of people who, despite all of the subsidies and the support schemes which have been laid out, will still be struggling to pay their energy bills. It speaks to just how aloof politicians, and particularly this eco agenda, is from ordinary people, that nevertheless it's the environmentalism that always wins out. We're now having a conversation, right, let's shift the levies over to the gas bills to try and force people to get rid of their combi boilers. It's widely accepted that gas boilers are much more efficient at heating people's homes, and yet and the alternatives in the forms of heat pumps, which have proven very unpopular, are wildly expensive and worse at doing the job. So colder and poorer is what is being sold to them. So I find it so fascinating that what we used to call bread and butter issues, or even when we're constantly talking about the cost of living, again, it has to come second to this agenda. It can't even be paused. It can't even take a few years off.
Yeah, it's got to be accelerated.
It's got to be accelerated, and that is telling, I think.
I mean, it's interesting because the new sort of line from the government is that net zero is actually going to increase our energy security and it's going to make our bills cheaper.
It's going to make everyone more attractive.
Give women bigger boobies, as Boris Johnson once said about voting Tory. But I mean, we know this is just rubbish because it's not like green energy has never been tried before. We have quite a lot of it, and we can tell from experience that it isn't working. The brutal fact is that when the wind doesn't blow and when the sun doesn't shine, we come perilously close to running out of electricity. Even we had that experience last year where we had to spend more than 5,000% the normal price for electricity just to ensure we didn't get a blackout. Those problems are only going to get worse if we carry on down this net zero path. And yet the government is kind of saying the opposite is going to happen. We're going to be more secure because we're going to be making energy in Britain. We're going to have cheaper energy because it's all going to come from the wind, forgetting all the time when the wind doesn't blow. I mean, what do you make of that kind of turn, Inaya? I mean, it's just, how do they think they can get away with it?
Well, I mean, they do get away with it because, I mean, even in a lot of the mainstream media discussion, it is very much a fait accompli. You know, there isn't these difficult questions that are asked, and there is a lot of dishonesty in the debate. And I mean, even on the government's or successive government's own terms, that they have made it more difficult for us to actually have diversities of energy supply. I mean, there's a video that did the rounds several months ago of Nick Clegg when he was in government a decade ago, so in 2011, saying, well, he was quite proud of essentially stopping the building of a new nuclear power station because it's going to take 10 years. That would have been 2021. So, I mean, it just shows the short-termism, elevating what is politically expedient over what would actually secure the long-term future and energy security of the country. And it's continuing to go on. I mean, as you mentioned, when the wind isn't blowing, when the sun isn't shining, then we don't have energy. But actually the other options that aren't even coal and oil, such as nuclear, and even fracking, you know, even in the north of England, in Yorkshire, we're kind of sitting on, huge potential reserves, but that have been completely stopped by certain environmental activists, which would have provided amazing kind of high quality, high paid, high skilled jobs, brought wealth and opportunities to an area, and would have created so much plentiful energy for huge sections of the country. And that has actually been partly responsible for what has brought down carbon emissions in America, which has been fracking. So the other options, even that would even get us closer to different energy sources, are being stopped as well. And so it just seems to be an attack on ordinary people on all ends for a lack of dishonesty. And fundamentally, the principle that should guide is cheap, plentiful, reliable. And if it is cleaner, that's also a plus. But ultimately, we have to exist in the modern world. We have to be able to have energy that powers our lives. And if we don't have that, then that is a world of darkness and destruction. So actually all of these activists kind of painting a picture of this terrible world if we don't rapidly go towards their particular narrow direction, they're actually making it more likely for us to live in a miserable world that people cannot actually live flourishing, positive lives. And so at the very least, we should have much more honesty about the reality and not these kind of slogans and grandstanding.
Yeah, definitely. And Tom, finally, I mean, something has got to give. In some places in Europe, I'm thinking things are, cracking up. If you think about the Netherlands, the Dutch farmers are not only out there protesting, but they've won a huge electoral victory recently. That's connected to net zero. I mean, we haven't even had that discussion here in Britain about how they're going to rein in agricultural emissions. But, this nitrogen law that has got them angry is a net zero product. Something surely will bubble up or flare up.
I think it's got to have political consequences, whether you see that at the ballot box or whether you see it on the streets. I mean, it's something which is easy to forget about the Gilets jaunes as well in France. I mean, that was in response to, again, punishing green laws and taxes. This was something that immediately impacts upon a certain section of society who rely on these supposedly dinosaur forms of transportation and so on to keep the country running, and they're not going to take that lying down. I mean, and also because of the fact that the green agenda seems to target the nuts and bolts of people's lives, like being able to cheaply run a car, being able to go about your own business, even being able to, drive around your own neighborhood relatively easily. All of these things are kind of part and parcel of this particular agenda, which I think is bound to cause some sort of pushback at some point. The difficulty is is that on the one hand, we don't have that kind of culture in Britain of protests that you have in France or elsewhere. And also the electoral options are, almost zero in terms of an alternative to this.
Vote red, vote blue, get green. Every
single time. And I think that's one thing which might stem a rebellion or make it a little bit more difficult for some time, but certainly not going to see it off forever. I think, if anything, in the absence of any alternatives, and as the cost of net zero on ordinary people is going to be felt more and more, it's just going to store up more and more anger, which is going to find expression somewhere or another at some point in time.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spiked's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.